There is a moment when waiting stops feeling quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with panic or drama. It arrives softly, almost politely, as a realization you can't unsee. You notice it when the room is quiet, when nothing bad is happening, when no one is asking anything from you. And suddenly you understand. You have been waiting. Not for something specific, not for a person, not for a message, not for a sign you can name out loud. You have been waiting for something to begin. Waiting for clarity, waiting for relief, waiting for the moment when it finally feels safe to exhale. Waiting for permission you don't remember asking for, but somehow never received. And what makes this moment unsettling is not the waiting itself. It's the realization that no one ever told you to wait. No one formally asked you to pause your life. No one signed a contract with you promising that something would arrive if you stayed still long enough. And yet, you stayed. You adjusted yourself. You softened your voice. You learned how to not take up too much space. You became careful with your feelings, just in case they were inconvenient. Somewhere along the way, waiting became your default state. Not active waiting, not hopeful anticipation, but a quiet suspension, as if your real life is standing just slightly behind you, and you're meant to step into it later. You don't even notice how much energy this takes, because from the outside, everything looks fine. You function, you show up, you respond, you handle what needs to be handled. You're not frozen, you're not broken, you're just postponed. And this is the part that's hardest to explain to anyone else, because nothing is wrong enough to justify how tired you feel. There is no single event you can point to, no dramatic turning point, no obvious loss, just a constant low-grade sense that something essential is on hold, as if you're living in the waiting room of your own life. And at some point, usually without warning, a question appears. It's not loud, it doesn't demand an answer. It simply asks, what am I waiting for? At first, you try to answer it logically. You tell yourself you're waiting until things calm down, until you feel more confident, until you understand yourself better, until someone meets you halfway, until you're sure you won't be too much. All reasonable answers, all familiar answers, but none of them fully explain the weight you're carrying. Because the truth is, you're not waiting for something external. You're waiting for the moment when it finally feels safe to be fully here. Safe to want what you want without apologizing. Safe to feel what you feel without minimizing it. Safe to exist without constantly monitoring yourself. And realizing this doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels unsettling. Because once you see the waiting, you also see how long it's been happening. You see how quietly it blended into your personality, how it disguised itself as patience, as maturity, as emotional intelligence. You see how often you told yourself, now is not the time, later will be better. I'll deal with this when things are clearer. And maybe the most uncomfortable part is this. You can't remember when you decided to live this way. There was no single choice, no clear agreement, just a slow adaptation, a series of small moments where it felt easier to pause yourself than to risk being misunderstood. And now, standing in this realization, you're not panicking, you're just quietly aware that waiting has become familiar, aware that it has shaped you, aware that it might be costing you more than you ever intended to give. This is not the moment where everything changes. This is the moment where you finally notice where you are. And that awareness, gentle as it seems, is not neutral. Once you see it, you can't fully go back to not knowing. Something has already shifted. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. The waiting has been named. And that changes the way it feels to carry it. Once you notice the waiting, something else becomes visible. It's not just that you've been waiting, it's how you learn to do it so well. because this wasn't laziness, and it wasn't fear in the obvious sense. It was adaptation. You learned to read the room before you read yourself. You learned which parts of you were welcomed and which ones caused tension. You learned how to stay connected without fully arriving, not because you wanted to disappear, but because staying was safer than standing out. At some point, you realized that being fully present came with consequences. Being honest could make things complicated. Being emotional could make things uncomfortable. Being clear could make you seem difficult. So you became subtle instead. You learned how to soften your edges, how to translate your needs into something more acceptable, how to pause your reactions long enough to decide whether they were allowed. And over time, this didn't feel like suppression anymore. It felt like maturity. You told yourself you were being patient, understanding, emotionally aware. You told yourself you were choosing peace. But there's a difference between peace and self-erasure. Peace has weight to it. It feels grounded. It feels steady. Waiting feels hollow. Waiting feels like holding your breath quietly while telling yourself you're fine. And the reason this becomes so hard to untangle is because waiting often gets rewarded. People appreciate you. They describe you as calm, easy to be around, low maintenance. You don't cause scenes. You don't demand explanations. You don't insist on clarity when things are ambiguous. From the outside, you look composed. Inside, you're constantly negotiating with yourself. Is this worth bringing up? Am I overreacting? Should I let this go? Would it be easier to stay quiet? These questions don't feel dramatic. They feel practical. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you stop asking a different question. What do I actually feel right now? Because asking that would require you to stay with the answer, and staying with the answer might require movement. Waiting, on the other hand, requires nothing. It allows you to postpone decisions without calling it avoidance. It allows you to remain available without being exposed. It allows you to exist in a kind of emotional standby mode, always present, never fully engaged. There's also something else you might notice if you look closely. Waiting creates the illusion of control. As long as you're waiting, you can tell yourself you're being careful, you're observing, you're gathering information. You're not failing, you're preparing. But preparation without arrival quietly turns into distance. Distance from your own reactions, distance from your own impulses, distance from the parts of you that don't fit neatly into expectations. And this distance doesn't hurt all at once. It accumulates. It shows up as fatigue you can't explain, as a dull sadness without a clear cause, as a sense that life is happening slightly to the side of you. You're involved, but not immersed. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: no one is asking you to keep waiting anymore. The environment may have changed. The people around you may have changed. You may even be safer now than you once were, but the habit remains. Waiting becomes internalized. It's no longer about external permission. It's about internal hesitation. You pause yourself automatically. You second guess instinctively. You delay without needing a reason. Not because you don't want more, but because wanting more feels exposed. And exposure still feels risky, even when the danger is no longer obvious. This is why simply telling yourself to stop waiting never works. Because waiting isn't a choice you make consciously anymore. It's a pattern your nervous system recognizes as familiar. It's the way you learn to survive while staying connected. And survival patterns don't disappear just because circumstances improve. They linger. They whisper. They suggest caution long after caution is necessary. So when you find yourself waiting now, it's not a personal failure. It's evidence of how attentive you once had to be, how much you learned to sense shifts in atmosphere, how quickly you learned to adjust. And recognizing this doesn't mean you suddenly know what to do next. It just means the waiting stops feeling neutral. It starts to feel visible. And once something becomes visible, it no longer has the same quiet power over you. You may still be standing in the waiting room, but now you're aware that it is a waiting room. And awareness, even without action, begins to change the experience of staying there. There is a moment that often arrives quietly, not as a breakdown, not as a dramatic realization, just a subtle shift. You begin to notice that the waiting has changed you, not in a way that's easy to point to, but in the way you relate to your own inner movement. You don't rush anymore, but you also don't lean forward. You don't resist life, but you don't step into it either. You stay slightly behind your own impulses. When something inside you wants to respond, you pause. When a feeling rises, you monitor it. When clarity starts forming, you soften it before it becomes too defined. It's not that you don't feel things. You feel them deeply, but you experience them through a filter of delay, as if every emotion needs to be checked for safety before it's allowed to exist fully. And over time, this creates a strange internal split. There's the part of you that senses something immediately, a tightening, a warmth, a pull, a quiet certainty. And then there's the part of you that steps in right after, the one that says, let's wait, let's see, let's not jump to conclusions. This second voice often sounds reasonable, measured, mature. It protects you from embarrassment, from regret, from being misunderstood. But it also keeps interrupting the first voice, the one that knows without explaining, the one that reacts before words form. And slowly, you begin to trust the second voice more, because it keeps things calm, it keeps things controlled, it keeps you from being exposed in ways that once felt dangerous. The cost of this isn't obvious at first. You don't suddenly feel empty. You don't lose your ability to connect. What changes is subtler. Your emotional life becomes quieter, but not lighter. Decisions take longer. Desires become less clear. Preferences feel negotiable. You start to feel as though everything inside you is provisional, as if nothing fully counts until it's validated by time, context, or someone else's response. This is where the waiting becomes more than a habit. It becomes a posture toward yourself. You begin to experience your own inner life as something that needs approval. Not explicitly, just implicitly. You don't fully claim a feeling when it appears. You observe it, you manage it, you give it space, but not authority. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to recognize when something truly matters to you. Because importance requires presence, and presence requires risk. Risk doesn't always mean conflict. Sometimes it simply means allowing something to exist without diluting it. Letting a feeling be strong without explaining it away. Letting a want be clear without softening it. Letting a boundary be felt internally before it's spoken, or even if it's never spoken. Waiting interferes with this process. It creates a buffer between sensation and acknowledgement, and that buffer slowly reshapes how you experience yourself. You may notice this when someone asks you a direct question. What do you want? How do you feel about this? Does this work for you? You don't panic, you don't freeze, but you hesitate. Not because you don't care, but because the answer feels unfinished, as if it needs more time to be correct, more time to be safe, more time to be acceptable. And so you respond carefully. You give partial truths, contextual answers, answers that leave room for adjustment. You keep the door open. And open doors can feel generous, but they can also prevent arrival. Because arriving means choosing a position. It means letting something land. Waiting keeps things suspended. It keeps you mobile but unrooted. And this is where a quiet grief sometimes appears. Not loud enough to demand attention, not sharp enough to name easily. Just a sense that you are constantly accompanying yourself, but rarely standing with yourself. You're nearby, supportive, attentive, but slightly removed, as if you're always observing your life from one step back. This isn't because you lack courage. It's because you learned that being fully in your own experience once had consequences. You learned that presence could disrupt balance, that certainty could provoke reaction, that clarity could invite resistance. So you learned to stay fluid, and fluidity helped you survive. But it also made it harder to feel solid. What's important to notice here is that none of this is a mistake. It's not a flaw. It's an imprint, a pattern formed in response to real conditions. And patterns don't vanish when circumstances change. They continue operating until they are recognized, not judged, but seen. You may not know yet what it would feel like to stop waiting. That's okay. At this stage, it's enough to notice how often you pause yourself, how often you defer your own immediacy, how often you place your inner life on hold, not for others, but for safety. This noticing doesn't demand action. It doesn't ask you to become someone else. It simply brings you closer to the place where the waiting lives. And closeness over time alters relationship, not through force, not through decisions, but through a quiet change in how something is held. When you stand close to a pattern long enough, it stops feeling like the air you breathe. It becomes something you can sense. You don't fight it. You don't analyze it. You simply notice when it appears. The pause before you answer. The hesitation before you feel. The internal step back before you arrive fully. This noticing doesn't remove the habit, but it interrupts its invisibility. And invisibility was its greatest strength, because as long as the waiting felt like who you are, there was nothing to relate to, no distance, no perspective, just identity. But now, something subtle begins to shift. The waiting becomes a behavior, not a definition, a response, not a truth, a learned movement, not your essence. And when that happens, a new question quietly emerges, not a loud one, not a demanding one, just a gentle internal curiosity. What would it feel like to not delay this moment, not to act on it, not to explain it, just to stay with it, unfiltered? This question doesn't push you forward, it invites you inward, because the opposite of waiting is not action, it's presence. Presence doesn't require courage in the way we usually imagine it. It doesn't mean confrontation or boldness or certainty. It means allowing a sensation to exist without managing it, letting a feeling be complete, even if it's uncomfortable, letting a preference be clear, even if it's inconvenient, letting an inner yes or no settle without immediately negotiating it. For someone who learned to survive by staying adjustable, this can feel strangely exposed. Not unsafe, just unfamiliar. As if you're standing in your own experience without leaning on anything. No explanation, no buffer, no contingency plan. And this is often where fear gets misunderstood, because the fear that arises here is not fear of consequences. It's fear of solidity, of being defined by your own inner truth, even temporarily. Because once something inside you becomes clear, it creates a shape, and shapes can be seen, responded to, pushed against. So the old reflex whispers, stay open, don't finalize, keep room to adjust. And sometimes you still will. That's not failure. What's different now is that you'll feel the moment when you choose to wait. You'll feel the exact place where presence was available and gently postponed. And feeling that moment matters because it reconnects you with agency. Not agency over outcomes, but agency over contact. Contact with yourself. You're no longer absent during your own pauses. You're there, aware, witnessing the trade-off. And over time, this awareness does something unexpected. It restores trust. Not the dramatic kind, not the I believe in myself now kind. A quieter trust. The kind that grows when you realize you can feel something fully and remain intact. That clarity doesn't destroy connection. That presence doesn't automatically lead to conflict. That being inwardly solid doesn't mean becoming rigid. This trust doesn't eliminate waiting, but it softens its grip. It creates choice. And choice changes the internal atmosphere. You begin to sense that your inner life doesn't need constant supervision, that feelings can arise and pass without being corrected, that you don't need to preemptively shrink your experience to keep the peace. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the waiting stops being the center. It becomes one option among others. Sometimes you'll still choose it, sometimes you won't, but the difference is this: you'll be present for the choice. And presence, over time, rebuilds orientation. You start to feel where you are again, not as a role, not as a response, but as a living position. This doesn't resolve everything. It doesn't promise relief. What it offers instead is something more foundational, a return, not to who you were before the waiting, but to a place inside you that was never actually gone, only postponed. And from that place, something begins to take shape. Not urgency, not certainty, just a quiet readiness to meet the next moment without stepping away from it. And that readiness, even when it's fragile, is already a form of movement. There is something important to notice before we move on. Readiness doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't feel like confidence. It doesn't feel like certainty. Most of the time, it feels like a quiet discomfort with the way things have always been, a subtle tension between what you allow yourself to feel and what you immediately soften, delay, or translate. You may not feel ready to stop waiting, but you may start feeling tired of disappearing inside the pause. And that matters, because there's a difference between waiting because you need time and waiting because you no longer trust your own inner timing. One protects you. The other slowly erases you. In the next chapter, we won't talk about action. We won't talk about courage. We won't talk about change in the usual sense. We'll look at something quieter and more confronting. The moment when you realize that the waiting is no longer about safety, but about permission. Permission to exist without asking. Permission to take up emotional space. Permission to let something inside you be true, even if nothing changes outside yet. Because before anything moves forward, there is always a moment when you feel yourself standing at the edge of your own life. Not pushed, not pulled, just standing there and asking a question you may have avoided for a long time. What happens if I don't step back this time? That question is where the next series begins.